The Galaxy S4 Mini was a mid-range smartphone released in July of 2013, and as its name implies, it was the small version of the best-selling Android, the Galaxy S4, and the successor to the Galaxy S3 Mini, which was only 6 months old when the S4 Mini was announced. But despite being from almost the same time period, the S4 Mini saw a massive upgrade over its predecessor, but now it's been 9 years since its launch, and the Android landscape has evolved considerably since 2013. So today we get to revisit the legendary, the iconic Galaxy S4 Mini. We'll start off with the main differentiation point between it and its older brother, the screen. In 2013, phones with big screens were still taking off, and not everyone was ready to take the leap. So Samsung saw the opportunity to sell a smaller but capable version of their flagship. As a result, we've got a 4.3-inch screen, down from the 5 inches of the Galaxy S4. The resolution is 960 by 540, which came quite close to being HD, giving us a decent pixel density of 258 pixels per inch. And I say decent considering there are still devices with lower pixel densities being released to this day, such as the Steam Deck or the Nintendo Switch OLED. Since not many complain about the resolution of those devices, I think we've kind of moved on from that crazy number war we used to have back in 2013. The Super AMOLED display at the time was excellent. It offered punchy colors, high contrast, and pure blacks, as well as amazing viewing angles compared to the dull screens of most phones of the time. But today it's a different story. The screens have gotten so much better, this screen no longer stands out as much as it used to, though I still think it looks good. Despite the clear advantages, going AMOLED had some compromises. Brightness levels were low, reaching a maximum of 396 nits, slightly below the S4 that offered 404 nits, and both well below the competition in the form of the LG Optimus G or the iPhone 5s, which offer brightness levels well past 600. This means it's hard to see anything on the screen under direct sunlight, but it's enough for interiors. And finally, the biggest drawback which still plagues this technology to this day, the infamous burn-in, which on a unit I have is pretty noticeable, with the keyboard burned into the screen. Moving on to specs, we have a dual-core Snapdragon 400 running at 1.7 GHz. In 2013, this series of processors were not as low-end as they are now, since the 200 series filled that place, while the 600 and later the 800 series were reserved only for the finest of the finest. This chip is more powerful than the Snapdragon S4 Pro of the Galaxy S3 and almost 3 times faster than the old Galaxy S3 Mini. And as someone who had just purchased the Galaxy S3 Mini when the S4 Mini was announced, I was like, okay, it's probably just a small improvement, nothing to regret here. But when the first tests and gameplays came out, I was shocked to see the massive upgrade in processing power. The thing is, the S4 Mini wasn't even that far behind its older brother, who had to move a 1080p screen along with all those extra functions and bloatware Samsung introduced with it. But many of these features didn't make a comeback on the Galaxy S4 Mini. That meant it was as fast or even faster at times than the Galaxy S4. It was so good, it was even faster than newer phones like the Galaxy J2 Prime, which came out 3 years later. Software-wise, the S4 Mini was originally launched with Android 4.2.2 Jelly Bean, version that today is almost obsolete. Thankfully, Samsung remembered this phone and updated it to Android KitKat, which can still be used for the basics. Unfortunately, Google banned on this version in 2021, and as a result, the support of third-party software is also falling rapidly, so the future looks quite gloomy for KitKat. Thankfully, there's a very talented community behind that's managed to port even Android 12, though I will not install that version here as it's not the most stable for everyday use. Instead, I went for Lineage OS 16.1 based on Android 9, which gives a nice balance between stability, speed, and compatibility with newer versions of apps, as well as providing a security patch up to August 2022. I also tested other ROMs like Lineage OS 14.1, which probably is the best ROM for this phone, though the fact it doesn't have root access by default is a big bummer for me. Instead, I recommend the ROM Bliss 6.4 based on Android 6, which has a much higher level of customization, as well as being faster than Android 9, if speed is the priority. And as a bonus, we can install a kernel, in this case the Remix kernel, which allows us to overclock the phone up to 2 GHz. We can take it from 480 MHz to 627, which can give us a few extra frames when playing. A nice thing we can do with ROMs running Android 7 or higher is that they enable us to use multi-window, which in 2013 only a handful of devices could do. Besides, we can also use the Google Assistant as if it were a modern device, a thing that could come in handy for some people. Always on display makes a comeback from the Galaxy S4. To turn it on, we just have to wave the hand on the screen. This phone is so small and thin, you kind of forget you have it with you. And this is a great thing for using apps like Strava. For jogging or cycling, large phones are cumbersome to carry due to the bulk they create in our pockets. But not this phone. It takes less than 5 seconds to find my location, and the connection is quite good. Unique perks of this device like the handy IR blaster to control the TV work just fine, though you need to download an app from the Play Store to use it. The radio on the other hand does come with the app pre-installed with the custom ROM. I tried web browsing here and the experience was actually pretty good for something this old. Depending on how resource intensive the page is, or how many tabs or apps we have open in the background, we could see some lag. Though it'll deal just fine with simple searches on Google or loading light pages such as Wikipedia or Instagram. But if we open a couple heavy pages at the same time, like LG.com, Stellarium, or Apple.com, or all three at the same time, we can see it struggles a little bit more with that task. Yet, nothing I would consider a terrible experience. We can install and use basic social media apps such as WhatsApp or Telegram with no issues. The same goes for other apps like Instagram, TikTok, or even Discord, which by the way is no longer available for Android 4.4. Spotify also runs great, and we can use the headphone jack or even Bluetooth to listen to music. Then we have Snapchat, which is much more demanding than the previous apps, especially when it comes to using the lenses. We can see how it struggles applying them, but at the end, it does manage to complete the task successfully. As for YouTube, the app on Android 4.4 is on its last legs, and most likely it'll stop working by 2023, but having installed Android 9, we can use the latest and greatest version of the app and be able to play videos up to 1080p 30. Of course, it'll lag a little bit on occasions, especially when navigating through the interface, but nothing I would consider annoying. When it comes to gaming, we won't have issues playing casual games like Brawl Stars, Clash Royale, or Plants vs Zombies. The worst thing though is playing these games on such a small screen, which could result in misclicks or placing the cards where we didn't want to. And some bad news, when I was making this video, Supercell just announced the end of support for Android KitKat, so the only way to play this game now is by upgrading to Android 5 or higher. Then we got relatively heavy games like Free Fire, which is playable even at max graphics, but we're gonna see significant drops in frame rate with these settings, so medium settings would be the most ideal for this phone. GTA San Andreas, which came out the same year as this phone, runs on medium settings, and as you can see, I have the game full of mods such as the mod to change skins or the mod to fly, and perhaps this is the reason it runs slower than it should be. The latest version of Minecraft surprisingly does run here, though the performance leaves much to be desired, even with the settings set almost on low, and the rain doesn't help either. But the fact we can somewhat play the latest version of this game is something quite remarkable. Nova 3, a marvel of its time, runs quite well, and there's pretty much nothing to complain about, like it is the case with most heavy old school games. In 2013, we saw the release of Deus Ex The Fall, a year that was amazing for mobile gamers. I would even go as far as saying it was the best year for gaming on mobile platforms for reasons I will explain in a future video. PUBG Mobile does actually run. The performance isn't the best, but the fact it opens the game and delivers a somewhat playable experience is amazing. I had previously tested the game in 2019, and the performance was much better than now. Call of Duty Mobile came installed from the Play Store. I managed to get it to work, and I was able to play the tutorial. And to my surprise, it ran quite well. But when I finished the tutorial, the game got stuck on the start menu, and I spent way too much time trying to get it to work again, but I couldn't. So I think we reached the limit of what we can do with this little machine. The game not long ago was actually playable, so if the developers optimized the game for this hardware in mind, the game would be more than playable, but that will never happen. When it comes to emulation, this is where we can notice the insane improvement over the Galaxy S3 Mini. To start off with the PS1, that phone emulated this console very well on default settings, but the problem was the audio, which by default was set to high latency and sound effects too low, which resulted in bad sound, and if we turned up those settings, it would get really laggy and it was not worth it. But here, not only can we put the audio on very low latency and full sound effects, but also play the games at 2x resolution, which results in a much better experience. Driver 2, a very demanding game, runs at 2x resolution at 60 frames per second, with some small drops. Anyway, the game looks good and plays good. Resident Evil 3 runs great at 2x resolution, plus all the sound effects at max, which make a huge difference. I really don't understand how I didn't realize the audio could sound this good, since I played this game with the audio on low a few years ago. We have a similar situation with Nintendo 64. We can also play most games at 2x resolution and remove the audio latency. And as you can see, we get a nice and steady frame rate with Mario 64. With Mario Kart 64, we also get a solid performance, and this is going to be the case for most Nintendo 64 games. One of the few exceptions is GoldenEye 64, which has some small frame drops when there are many NPCs on screen, but overall it's a perfectly playable game. I also tested Nintendo DS emulation, turned up the settings, and took frame skipping to 0, and it had a blast emulating probably the most resource intensive game for the console, Metroid Prime Hunters. So I don't see the need to show more Nintendo DS games here. Moving on to other consoles like the PSP, we have that almost all the games are gonna run very well, but as always, it's the top 5 games in graphics that are gonna be hard to emulate. Anyway, let's start with Ben 10 Protector of Earth, which runs perfectly even at 3x resolution, which is incredible considering the S3 Mini or the $1 phone struggle to run this game even at 1x. Ben 10 Ultimate Alien requires much more resources than the previous Ben 10 game, but still, it runs great even at 2x graphics, in contrast to the Galaxy S3 Mini which had mediocre performance even on the lowest settings. Taking it up a notch with Vice City Stories, we find ourselves with two possible settings. In the first, we can leave the settings by default and the game will run quite well, or the second, which is putting the resolution at 2x, but having to increase the frame skipping to 1. The thing is, I prefer the second option since the resolution difference really makes a big difference. With Parasite Eve like the previous game, we have two options. Play the game with default settings just fine, or set the frame skipping to 1 but play at 2x resolution like in my case. And finally for PSP, we have God of War Chains of Olympus, a top PSP game that, as you know, requires a lot of resources. Here I had to turn on frame skipping and disable buffered rendering to get a playable experience, but even that will depend on your tolerance to some of the image flickering that we get as a result. When it comes to the camera, we have an 8 megapixel sensor. It may not sound like much, but honestly back in the day, it was really good for the range of price it sold, and even today it's still capable of giving decent results. During the day and with the HDR on, the camera manages to deliver decent colors, decent dynamic range, as well as okay levels of detail. However, it's in low light conditions where it suffers. It doesn't handle strong lights too well, plus we have a lot of grain and noise. And we also have a night mode, which does make quite a difference as you can see in the examples. Though the aspect where I think the S4 Mini stands out the most is in macro photography. Thanks to having a small sensor, we can get closer to the subject than otherwise would have been the case with a bigger sensor, and this translates into more than decent macro photos. For example, this photo of my cat, where the phone was able to capture a very good amount of detail. Out of all of the improvements, the camera section was the one where we saw the biggest leap from the previous generation, where we can see that the difference between both generations is as clear as day and night. And even though I took those photos from the same distance, the S4 Mini captured much more of the scene. In low light conditions though, the photos of the Galaxy S3 mini look horrible next to its successor. As for video, we can record up to 1080p at 30 frames per second, being one of the few phones that didn't belong to the flagship category of 2013 to be able to do this. Since we don't have optical stabilization, videos can get quite shaky, though in general, video in ideal lighting conditions still looks decent. The selfie camera was fine at the time, but for today's standards, it's really bad. In conclusion, the S4 mini is still a legendary phone that even today can be used for almost everything if we're willing to give it a second chance. Whether or not it's worth it is up to you, though I wouldn't recommend this device to people with little to no knowledge about modifying phones. I can already see people with stock RAM and with very heavy apps they don't use in their lives running in the background, and making the phone run poorly as a result. Speaking of my case, it is worth it. The S4 mini is so small, it's ideal to take it out for a run. And even though I know there are other smarter phones that are more capable, such as the iPhone SE, but for those of us who live in fear of losing our phone, the Galaxy S4 mini is a great choice given how cheap it is. On top of that, I have a lot of fun doing things like installing and testing new versions of Android, overclocking the phone to get the most out of it, etc. Managing to do seemingly impossible feats most people think are impossible. Anyway, that's the end of the video guys. Thanks for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.